We've walked through the frontiersmen's many hidden strengths. We've seen how fire warmed their nights, how cabins rose from forests, how rivers offered life, and how tools stood faithfully by their side. But survival wasn't just about the dramatic skills of chopping wood or navigating by the stars. Most of life on the frontier was found in the quiet hours, the daily chores, the small comforts, and the steady routines that turned a vast wilderness into a home. The days were long, sometimes monotonous, but always purposeful. From dawn until dusk, frontiersmen and women lived not in grand events, but in the simple rhythm of work and rest, season after season. The first light of day came not with an alarm clock, but with the sound of a rooster crowing, or the hush of mist rising from the fields. Mornings on the frontier carried a quiet, focused energy. The first task was always to stir the fire, that faithful friend of warmth and cooking. A child might be sent to fetch kindling. A mother would kneel by the hearth, coaxing life from last night's embers, while the smell of fresh bread or cornmeal cakes began to drift through the air. The men often set out early, carrying axes or rifles depending on the day's needs. Some went to tend fields, others ventured into the woods for hunting. Still others repaired fences, tools, or the cabin itself. These morning hours were sacred for work. They set the tone for the entire day's survival. Unlike our modern lives, frontier chores didn't really end. They just rotated. Water had to be drawn daily, whether from a nearby spring, a stream, or a well. Buckets were heavy, but carrying them was as ordinary as breathing. Livestock needed tending. Chickens fed, cows milked, horses brushed and watered. Children learned early that survival wasn't just for adults. Gathering eggs, chopping kindling, or weeding the garden were small but vital contributions. Then there was the laundry. Forget tossing clothes into a machine. This was a day-long ordeal of hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing garments by hand, and hanging them on lines to dry in the sun. It was a task that took immense patience. And always, there was wood to split. No task was more constant, more symbolic of the frontier, than keeping the woodpile full. Every log cut in the summer was a promise of warmth in the winter. Each swing of the axe was a quiet act of preparation. Food was the central beat of this daily rhythm. Frontier meals weren't extravagant, but they carried a deep sense of comfort. Cornbread, beans, stews, salt pork, and wild game when available. These staples filled the table. Meals weren't hurried affairs. They were moments to pause, to gather, and to share stories of the day's work. It was at the dinner table that family bonds were woven strongest. One visitor to a frontier cabin wrote of being welcomed to a meal that was plain but hearty. He recalled the warmth of the fire, the simple wooden table, and the way conversation flowed gently between bites. It wasn't wealth that made the evening rich, but the profound sense of belonging. Frontier life was ruled by the seasons. Each one brought its own chores and its own rhythm. Spring was for planting. Fields were cleared, seeds sown, and gardens prepared. The long days were filled with hope for the harvest to come. Summer meant tending crops, repairing the cabin, and storing wood. It was a time of hard labor, but also of abundance. Autumn was the harvest season, the most demanding but also the most rewarding. Families worked together to gather crops, preserve meat, and store provisions for the winter. Smokehouses filled with salted pork, shelves lined with jars of dried beans and fruit. Every task was a preparation for the cold months ahead. Then came winter, a season of endurance. The work didn't stop, but it slowed down. Fires were kept high, clothes were mended, and tools repaired. Children learned by the firelight, listening to stories or practicing their letters. Outside, snow covered the land in a deep silence. To live by these seasons was to live in tune with the earth itself, accepting both its gifts and its demands. Though life was hard, it was not without joy. Settlers knew the value of small comforts. A warm quilt stitched by hand, a rocking chair by the fire, a simple tune played on a fiddle after supper, neighbors gathering for a barn raising, where work turned into fellowship. Children found games in the simplest things, a carved wooden toy, a hoop rolled across the yard, or a race down to the stream. Their laughter was as much a survival skill as any tool, for it lifted the hearts of their parents and reminded them why all the work mattered. And they treasured letters. A scrap of paper carrying words from far away could brighten spirits for weeks. News traveled slowly, but when it arrived, it was read and reread, folded carefully, and stored like a treasure. While we often imagine the lone frontiersman, survival was rarely a solitary act. Community mattered. A single family couldn't build a barn alone, but 10 families together could raise one in a single day. These gatherings were part work, part celebration. Neighbors also came together for harvests, for hunting trips, and in times of sickness or hardship. The wilderness could be unforgiving, but kindness, shared freely, made it bearable. As daylight faded, the cabin became the center of life once more. Candles flickered, the fire glowed, and the comforting smells of supper filled the air. Evenings were for reflection, for mending clothes, sharpening tools, or reading from the family Bible. Children might fall asleep to stories, tales of old homelands, of ancestors, or of faith. The cabin walls, rough and simple, held within them the very heartbeat of survival, the warmth of family, the security of shelter, and the peace of knowing that for one more day life had been sustained. Frontier life wasn't glamorous. It was steady. The days flowed into one another like streams into rivers. And yet, within that repetition was a kind of peace. The settlers found meaning not in rare excitement, but in the quiet satisfaction of survival itself. To plant and harvest, to build and repair, to endure and to rest. This was the shape of their existence. So as you go about your day, consider your own routines. The small tasks you repeat, cooking a meal, folding laundry, tidying your space, may feel ordinary, but they are the steady rhythm of survival in your own life, just as vital as the chores of the frontier. They are the small, faithful acts that create a home. The frontier teaches us that survival is not only about great skills or dramatic moments, it is about the quiet, enduring rhythm of daily life, a rhythm that still beats gently in our own homes today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you found meaning in this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more reflections on the quiet strengths that shape our lives. We'll see you next time. On the American frontier, gathering food was only half the battle. The other half was keeping it. Without refrigerators, freezers, or supermarkets, families faced the same question every autumn. How would they make their supplies last through the long, unforgiving winter? Hunting, farming, and foraging filled pantries for a time, but winter demanded foresight. It demanded the art of preservation. Preserving food wasn't just an afterthought. It was survival itself. A single mistake in preparation could mean hunger or even starvation when snow lay heavy on the land. And so, settlers learned to rely on ancient methods, smoking, drying, salting, and fermenting, and on clever storage techniques like hide-covered caches and underground cellars. These quiet skills, often overlooked today, were what kept entire families alive when the world outside was frozen still. Perhaps the most iconic method was smoking. Imagine meat hanging over slow smoldering fires, absorbing the smoke's warmth and its natural protective chemicals. This wasn't a quick process. Sometimes it took days, even weeks, of steady, patient tending. A smokehouse was often little more than a simple log hut or a shed, with vents cut to let the smoke drift slowly upward. Inside, hams, venison, or fish would hang from the beams. The smoke curled around them, layer by layer, sealing the flesh against spoilage. The taste was distinctive, smoky, savory, and incredibly rich. Families welcomed it, not only because it lasted, but because it brought a sense of comfort during those long, dark winters. A strip of smoked venison beside the fire was more than just food. It was proof of preparation, a testament to the care taken months before. Not all preservation required fire. Drying was among the oldest and simplest methods. Strips of meat were cut thin and hung in the sun or near a hearth until every bit of moisture was gone. Without water, bacteria simply could not thrive. The result was jerky, tough, chewy, but incredibly durable. It could be eaten plain on the trail or softened in hearty stews. Fruits were also dried. Apples sliced into thin rings, berries spread across cloths, and corn kernels roasted until they hardened. Once dried, they could be stored for months, sometimes even longer, in simple cloth bags. Children often helped with this task. They would string the apple slices, carefully turn the berries, and learn the patient art of waiting while nature did its work. Drying wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, and on the frontier, reliability was everything. Salt was precious. It had to be mined, traded, or carried over long, difficult distances. But when a family had salt, they had security. Large cuts of meat were rubbed with salt until every single surface was coated. Sometimes brine, salt dissolved in water, was used instead, soaking the meat for days at a time. The salt drew out moisture, making it nearly impossible for bacteria to grow. Salted pork was an absolute staple. Packed into large barrels, it could be pulled out months later, soaked to remove the excess salt, and then cooked into nourishing stews. Though it might seem plain by our modern tastes, it was dependable, and dependability meant survival. Salt was so valued that entire journeys were made just to secure it. Some families measured their wealth not in coin, but in how many pounds of salt they had stored away for the winter. Fermentation carried with it a touch of magic. It turned ordinary vegetables into something that could last through the cold months, and often into something even more nutritious than before. Cabbages became sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles. Milk, in some households, became cheese or buttermilk. All of this happened thanks to invisible colonies of bacteria and yeast, working quietly in cool, dark places. Frontiersmen and women didn't speak of microbes. They didn't know the science behind it, but they knew the process worked. They watched as jars bubbled gently, as flavors sharpened, and as food remained edible long after the fresh harvests had ended. Fermentation wasn't just practical, it was also comforting. Pulling out a crock of sauerkraut in the middle of January reminded families of the green fields of summer. It was a taste of continuity, right in the heart of winter. Beyond preparation, storage itself was absolutely vital. Where could all this preserved food rest safely, away from animals, weather, and rot? Many families dug underground cellars. These cool, dark, and moist spaces were perfect for preserving root vegetables and jars of fermented goods. Lined with logs or stone, these small chambers were filled with potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions. Their earthen walls kept the temperature steady, far below the freezing air above ground. Others built hidden caches out in the woods. Food was sealed in containers, sometimes wrapped in animal hides, and then buried beneath soil or rocks. This method was risky, but it was effective when space was limited. A well-hidden cache could keep meat or grain safe from both wild animals and any wandering strangers. These storage techniques demanded creativity, but they extended the life of the food far beyond the season in which it was gathered. When the snows finally came, all this preparation was put to the test. A family's smokehouse, their cellar, and their salt barrels were no longer just projects. They were lifelines. Each jar opened, each strip of smoked meat unwrapped, was a tangible reminder of the hard work done months before. Winter meals often drew from all these methods at once: salted pork, dried apples, pickled cabbage, and cornbread made from stored meal. The meals were simple, but they were nourishing. The families who prepared carefully often endured with enough to get by. Those who didn't faced lean times, sometimes having to borrow from neighbors or rely on foraging even in the bitter cold. Preparation wasn't simply about saving food, it was about saving lives. One settler wrote of how his family survived a blizzard by living entirely off smoked venison and dried beans for nearly 3 weeks. He described the immense comfort of opening a cloth sack of jerky, knowing that even when the world outside was silent and deadly, nourishment remained within their reach. Another recalled the sharp smell of fermenting cabbage filling the cellar in autumn, and how in winter that tangy taste brought life back to otherwise dull meals. These stories may seem small, but they reveal a profound truth. Preservation was as heroic as hunting or building. It was less dramatic, perhaps, but it was no less vital. What made all this food preservation so powerful was foresight. It required thinking ahead, imagining the cold to come, and preparing for it with immense patience. This kind of wisdom is timeless. It reminds us that survival isn't only about strength in the present moment, but also about preparing quietly for the future. As you rest with this story, picture the incredible patience of those frontier families, Imagine the smoke curling from a small hut, jerky drying in the warm sun, barrels of salted pork lined up in neat rows, and jars quietly fermenting in cool cellars. Think of how much trust they placed in these simple methods in smoke, salt, sun, and earth to carry them through months of snow. Their survival wasn't found in haste, but in careful preparation. Now consider your own life. What do you preserve? Maybe not meat or cabbage, but perhaps memories, habits, or valuable lessons. What small actions are you taking today that might carry you through the winters of tomorrow? The frontier whispers to us still: prepare with care, respect the cycles of nature, and trust that the patient work of today will sustain you when times grow cold. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more reflections on the quiet wisdom of the past. Until next time, take care. Picture the American frontier, a vast, untamed wilderness. Here the land seemed to have no end. Forests stretched for miles, mountains rose like impenetrable walls, and rivers twisted in confusing, dizzying bends. Roads were a luxury, maps a rarity, and a compass was a treasure, not an everyday tool. To survive, the men and women of the frontier learned to trust the oldest guides of all: the stars shining above, the trees standing silently around them, the rivers flowing at their feet, and the wisdom they carried in their own memories. For them, navigation wasn't just a skill you learned from a book. It was a relationship with the land itself, a quiet, continuous dialogue with nature's signs. To walk into that vast wilderness without these abilities was to risk never returning. But for those who knew how to read the world, who could interpret its subtle language, they could cross forests, prairies, and mountains, carrying only the knowledge stored in their minds. It was a testament to human resilience and our deep connection to the natural world. Long before the frontier, sailors had charted their courses by the night sky. On land, the same celestial map became an indispensable compass. The North Star, Polaris, was the most trusted guide of all. Steady and unmoving, it gave direction to countless travelers. Settlers and explorers knew that if they could find that one star, they could orient themselves completely. North was certain, and from there, south, east, and west fell into place. Around the warmth of a campfire, parents would teach their children to trace the Big Dipper, pointing out how its two pointer stars lead straight to Polaris. They taught them to trust this distant light, a beacon that had guided their ancestors and would continue to guide them. The moon, too, had its role to play. Its rise and set, its ever-changing phases, helped mark both the passage of time and direction. On clear nights, the heavens transformed into a vast, eternal map, written not on fragile parchment but on the dark velvet canvas of the night sky. But of course, not every journey took place under starlight. During the day, the land itself spoke, but only to those who knew how to listen. Moss, for example, was a quiet but constant ally. It often grew thickest on the north side of trees and rocks, where the sunlight was weakest and the moisture lingered. While it wasn't a foolproof method, it offered a valuable hint when no other guide was present. The sun's steady path across the sky was another fundamental tool. The shadows it cast at midday pointed along a north-south line, while the arc of its rise and set clearly defined east and west. Keen observers who paid close attention developed an innate sense of direction, almost as if the sun itself was whispering guidance into their ear. Trees carried other signs as well. Their branches often grew thicker and more robust on the southern side, reaching eagerly for the life-giving sunlight. In winter, snow would sometimes melt first on the slopes that faced the sun. Each clue taken alone might seem small or insignificant, but when woven together, they formed a rich, detailed language of the land. Rivers were so much more than just sources of water. They were lifelines, highways, and boundaries. Many frontiersmen followed rivers to navigate the dense, confusing wilderness. A small stream often led to a larger river, and that river would eventually guide them to a known settlement or a trading post. Rivers marked the edges of territories, carried canoes for miles, and offered predictable though winding routes through otherwise unbroken forests. But rivers could also be deceptive. Their meandering paths could easily confuse a traveler, looping back on themselves or pulling them deep into impassable swamps. Knowing when to follow a river's edge and when to strike out on your own was a critical matter of judgment, one that could spell the difference between safety and utter despair. It was a constant dance of trust and caution, reading the water's flow while also keeping the larger landscape in mind. When groups traveled, they often left signs to mark their trails, a primitive but effective GPS. These could be simple signs, a stack of stones, a carefully bent branch, or carved notches on a series of trees. These markers became breadcrumbs scattered across the wilderness, a message for those who would follow. Some Native American peoples used blaze marks, skillfully cutting a strip of bark from a tree to leave a visible directional scar. Settlers quickly adopted similar methods, creating their own systems of marks that could be read by anyone who understood their meaning. Ultimately, though, memory was the greatest trail marker of all. Stories of a particular bend in the river, a distinctively shaped rock, or a tree split by lightning were passed down between generations. Children grew up knowing not just the layout of their own homestead, but the key landmarks of the entire region, committed to heart like the verses of a familiar song. This mental map, rich with shared experience and story, was often more reliable than any physical one. And for those who found themselves without a true compass, human ingenuity always filled the gap. A simple sewing needle, magnetized by rubbing it with silk or against a piece of iron, could be floated on water in a leaf or a bowl, where it would slowly turn to point north. Some used their knives or other bits of iron in a similar fashion. These makeshift compasses were fragile and required a steady hand, but in moments of crippling doubt, they could restore a traveler's confidence. The act itself, pausing, crafting a tool from scraps and watching it settle toward the unseen magnetic poles, carried its own quiet, profound reassurance. Even in the wildest, most desolate places, direction could still be found. History is rich with stories of travelers who strayed from their path, and those who survived by reading the land. One classic tale tells of a trapper who wandered too far while hunting and became completely lost. For days, he drifted in circles, his sense of direction gone. Then, recalling his father's lessons from childhood, he started looking for the moss on the trees and paying attention to the position of the sun. Following those simple ancient signs, he at last stumbled back to the familiar river that led him safely home. Another story tells of a group of settlers caught in a dense, disorienting fog. Without the stars to guide them, they were lost. But one woman, remembering the exact angle of the river in relation to their camp, guided them patiently by its bends until the fog finally lifted. The others called her wisdom the difference between despair and survival. But not every story ended so well. Some names survive only as cautionary tales, travelers who vanished into the forests, their trails never to be rediscovered. Their absence serves as a solemn reminder of just how fragile survival could be when direction was lost. To navigate the unknown was more than just a practical necessity. It gave a person a deep sense of confidence, a quiet calmness that steadied the mind even in the face of profound uncertainty. A traveler who could look to the stars, notice the subtle tilt of a tree, or follow the persistent pull of a river was never truly alone. Nature itself walked beside them, a constant companion offering signs and reassurance. This powerful bond between human and land was more than knowledge. It was a deep and abiding trust. Now, as we finish this story, I want you to imagine yourself walking beneath towering trees, far from any road or signpost. The sky darkens, and a familiar feeling of doubt starts to creep in. Then you look up. High above, the North Star appears, a single point of steady light. You remember the old lessons, the moss at the base of the trees, the sun's daily arc, the gentle pull of the nearby river. Slowly, that worry begins to fade. You realize the land is not a maze, but a teacher. Think of your own life. Sometimes you too may feel lost, uncertain of which way to turn. Yet, guidance always exists if you quiet yourself enough to see it. A friend's kind words, a cherished memory, a principle you hold dear. These are your stars, your rivers, your moss on the trees. The frontier whispers this eternal truth. Direction is always present. Sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's faint. But it's always there for those who look closely. So tonight, take a deep breath and rest in the knowledge that you are never truly without guidance. Like those who came before us, you carry within you the ability to find your way, through forests, through fog, and through life itself. Thanks for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories. Until next time, find your North Star. Life on the frontier was shaped as much by tools as it was by courage. The wilderness was vast, unforgiving, and full of challenges. But with the right tools, men and women turned dense forests into sprawling farms, danger into safety, and raw, untamed nature into something livable. On the frontier, tools weren't just possessions. They were companions. Each one bore the marks of hard use: scratches, chips, soot, and the smooth polish from countless hands. A good tool might be passed from father to son or shared among neighbors. And when tools broke, they weren't just thrown away. They were repaired, reforged, or repurposed. To truly understand the frontier is to understand the ingenuity behind these simple objects: the roaring fire of the blacksmith, the hunter's trusted carry, and the craftsman's improvisation with bone, stone, and wood. In every settlement, the blacksmith was more than just a craftsman. He was a lifeline. At the heart of his shop, the forge burned, glowing with heat and alive with sparks. With his hammer and anvil, he shaped raw iron into everything a family needed: plowshares for the fields, hinges for their doors, nails for their cabins, and knives for the hunt. The rhythm of his work, the steady ringing blows echoing across the village, became the very heartbeat of survival. Blacksmithing wasn't simple. It demanded incredible strength, patience, and precision. A poorly tempered blade could shatter in an instant. A weak hinge might fail when it was needed most. But a skilled smith could turn iron into resilience itself. Frontiersmen often carried tools shaped by their local smith: a hatchet that had cut hundreds of cords of wood, or a rifle barrel forged to last a lifetime. Without the blacksmith, the community's hands would be empty. Among the blacksmith's creations were the everyday essentials of life. Knives were perhaps the most personal of all. A blade was more than just a weapon. It was a tool for skinning game, cutting rope, carving wood, and preparing food. Worn at the belt, it was always within reach, a true extension of its owner's hand. Axes stood second only to the knife in importance. With them, cabins rose from the earth, firewood was split for warmth, and land was cleared for farming. Some axes were heavy, built for felling massive trees, while others were smaller and lighter, designed to be carried on long hunts. The axe was the frontier's most universal symbol of hard labor and unwavering endurance. Then there were the powder horns, carried by hunters and defenders alike. Made from polished cow horns, often carved with intricate designs, they kept precious gunpowder dry and safe. To run out of powder was to risk being utterly defenseless, so these horns were treasured and cared for as much as the rifles they served. And let's not forget the simple flints and steels, the very sparks of life. Without them, no fire could be started quickly. Carried in small pouches or pockets, they represented warmth, a hot meal, and protection from the darkness. A few quick strikes could mean the difference between a comfortable night and one spent shivering in the bitter cold. Together, these tools formed the silent companions of survival, a small but essential arsenal that stood between life and the vast wilderness. On the frontier, everyday carry wasn't a modern trend. It was a fundamental necessity. A settler rarely stepped outside without his knife, flint, and powder horn. Even women often carried small blades or fire-starting tools, and children learned from a young age to keep simple tools at hand. The logic was simple. The unexpected was always just around the corner. A rabbit might cross your path, offering a quick meal. A sudden storm might demand a fire for survival. A broken strap or a torn piece of clothing might need immediate repair. Tools were carried not out of habit, but out of a deep respect for the unpredictable nature of the land. But tools were not always forged from iron. The wilderness itself provided all the materials you needed, if you had the knowledge and creativity to see them. Bone could be carefully shaped into needles, fish hooks, or tool handles. Deer antlers became sturdy, reliable knife grips or buttons for clothing. Large bones were polished smooth to create effective scraping tools for tanning hides. Stone also served a purpose where metal was absent. Flint, when chipped with skill, created razor-sharp blades or arrowheads. Smooth river stones became hammers or weights for fishing nets. Even in the age of iron, stone remained incredibly useful to those who understood its value, and wood, abundant and versatile, was shaped into handles, clubs, bowls, and even spoons. Different trees offered different gifts: hickory for its unmatched strength, pine for its lightness, and cedar for its pleasant scent and natural durability. These improvised tools carried a special kind of pride. They spoke not of wealth or trade, but of pure adaptability, the quiet confidence that even without iron or nails, survival was still within reach. The journals of frontiersmen are filled with quiet, powerful tales of how a simple tool changed everything. One hunter, lost deep in the winter woods, carried nothing but his knife. With that single blade, he fashioned snares to catch food, carved kindling to start a fire, and even built a crude shelter from pine branches. That small, plain knife kept him alive until he found his way back home. Another settler wrote about his old chipped axe, the one he used to fell the tree that became the main ridge beam of his family's first cabin. He wrote that every blow felt like a prayer. With each swing, he felt he was shaping not just wood, but his children's future. These stories remind us that tools were not lifeless objects. They were active participants in the grand story of survival. What made frontier tools so remarkable was not only their function, but the spirit behind them. They were symbols of human adaptability, proof that with creativity and effort, people could meet any challenge head-on. Where others might see a simple bone, a stone, or a branch, the frontiersmen saw possibility. Where iron bent or broke, resourceful hands found ways to mend and reuse. This incredible ingenuity turned scarcity into strength. As we reflect on these stories, picture the blacksmith's forge glowing in the twilight, sparks leaping as the hammer strikes hot iron. Imagine the worn, smooth handle of an axe, shaped by years of hard work. Feel the reassuring weight of a knife at your belt, ready for whatever the day might bring. Now think for a moment about your own tools. They may not be axes or powder horns. They might be pens, computers, or even the habits you carry with you every day. Each one is a companion, each one shaped to help you navigate your own wilderness. The frontier teaches us that tools are not just objects. They are extensions of our will, forged by patience and guided by creativity. They remind us that with resourcefulness, even scarcity can become abundance. You, too, hold the tools you need. Whether they are made of steel or of spirit, of bone or of resolve, they are already in your hands. Trust them, sharpen them, and carry them with care, for they are your companions on the journey ahead. Thank you for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story inspiring, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories of ingenuity and survival. We'll see you in the next one. Step back in time with me, to a world where survival wasn't just about what you could build or hunt, but what you wore. On the American frontier, clothing was far more than a matter of appearance. It was protection, it was warmth, and often, it was the thin line between life and death. The wilderness didn't play favorites. Bitter winds sliced through forests, snows buried cabins, and the summer sun beat down without mercy. To face these elements, frontiersmen and women didn't turn to fashion catalogs. They turned to layers of fur, leather, and homespun fabric. Every stitch, every patch had a purpose. Their clothing was both armor and a lifeline. Long before factories hummed and textile mills churned, the frontier relied on the oldest materials known to humankind: fur and leather. Fur was warmth made tangible. A deer hide with its hair left on transformed into a winter cloak. Beaver pelts, prized for their dense, waterproof insulation, became the lining for caps and mittens. Even the humble rabbit or squirrel pelt could provide a soft, warm lining for a child's tiny garments. And then there was leather. Strong, durable, and incredibly versatile, leather was everywhere. Think of deerskin shirts and leggings, soft enough to move with the body but tough enough to turn away thorns and branches. Thicker hides from elk or buffalo became sturdy outerwear or heavy blankets to keep out the night's chill. Leather wasn't just worn, it was lived in. Each piece held the memory of the hunt, a quiet acknowledgement that survival was a cycle, built on respect for the animals that provided their hides. Nothing was wasted. The meat fed the family, the bones became tools, and the hide became the shield that kept the cold winds at bay. But not all clothing came directly from the forest. Inside cabins and small settlements, you would hear the hum of spinning wheels and the clatter of looms. This was the sound of homespun fabric being born from flax, wool, or cotton. Wool was especially cherished. Sheared from sheep carefully tended through the seasons, it had the incredible ability to provide warmth even when it was damp, making it perfect for coats, stockings, and heavy cloaks. For the warmer months there was linen. Woven from the flax plant, it was cooler, lighter, and much easier to wash. It felt kinder against the skin during the hot, humid days of summer. But don't mistake its lightness for ease. Every single thread represented hours upon hours of labor. Women carded the wool, spun the yarn, dyed the cloth with colors boiled from roots, berries, and bark, and then stitched every single garment by hand, often by candlelight. Clothing wasn't disposable. It was a treasured resource, repaired, patched, and repurposed until the fabric itself could serve no more. Now let's talk about footwear. On countless trails, the steps of settlers, trappers, and explorers were silenced by moccasins. Made from soft leather, usually deerskin, moccasins fit the foot like a second skin. They allowed for a quiet, stealthy step in the forest, an essential tool for any hunter or scout. Unlike heavy, clunky boots, they were lightweight, flexible, and could be repaired on the trail with just a needle and some sinew. Of course, they weren't perfect. In wet conditions, they could wear thin quickly. But the pioneers adapted. They learned to stuff their moccasins with dry grass or fur for insulation, or to add extra layers of leather for durability. Their simplicity was their strength. Even if a pair wore out completely, a new pair could be crafted from a fresh hide. But what about when winter buried the landscape in deep snow? In those conditions, ordinary boots were useless, sinking you with every step. This is where the genius of the snowshoe came in. These incredible contraptions, usually wide oval frames of wood laced with rawhide strips, allowed a person to walk on top of the snow. They worked by spreading your weight over a larger surface area, letting you glide across drifts that would otherwise be impassable. Walking in snowshoes required a new rhythm, a careful sliding step that was light and deliberate. It felt awkward at first, but soon became second nature. Snowshoes weren't a luxury. They were a lifeline. Without them, hunting in winter, checking on neighbors, or even just gathering firewood from the woodpile could become an impossible and dangerous task. The frontier was known for its sudden, violent storms. To survive, you needed outer layers that could be deployed at a moment's notice. Heavy wool cloaks and capes were essential pieces of gear. A good cloak could serve as a coat, an extra blanket at night, or even a makeshift shelter in an emergency. To combat the rain, they used oilcloth, a simple fabric treated with linseed oil or wax to make it waterproof. In a pinch, they might use oiled leather or even large pieces of bark to keep dry. These coverings weren't elegant, but they were brutally effective. A hood pulled low over the head, a cloak wrapped tightly around the body. These were the simple barriers that held precious warmth close and turned away the harshness of the elements. When we talk about armor on the frontier, we're not imagining knights in shining steel. We're talking about the quiet, practical armor of everyday clothing. Every piece was a shield. Leather leggings guarded against sharp briars and snake bites. A wide-brimmed hat kept the blistering sun off your face and the pouring rain from running down your neck. Mittens, often layered with fur inside, kept hands from stiffening in the cold, allowing vital work to continue. Every single garment was chosen not for how it looked, but for how it performed in the ongoing battle for survival against nature itself. History is filled with stories where clothing was the deciding factor between life and death. One trapper famously recalled falling through river ice. His heavy wool coat, though waterlogged and weighing him down, still retained enough of his body heat to save him from freezing before he could drag himself to shore. A settler-es diary described a terrifying blizzard where her family and neighbors huddled together under a pile of buffalo hides. She wrote that the hides became a moving house of warmth against the deadly, howling wind. Even the smallest garments carried immense weight. A child's simple knitted cap, passed down through the years, wasn't just an object. It was the memory of all the winter nights it kept a little head warm and safe from frost. Clothing, just like tools, was rarely brand new. It was a testament to persistence. Shirts carried layers of patches and mending from decades of use. Moccasins were resoled with scraps of whatever leather was available. A tear in a cloak was bound with cord, creating a tapestry of survival. And their ingenuity went even further. In an emergency, bark fibers could be woven into makeshift sandals. Dry grass was stuffed inside boots for a bit of extra insulation. Even old flour sacks could be cut and sewn into a crude but effective coat. The frontier didn't reward perfection, it rewarded persistence and creativity. While its primary purpose was practical, clothing also told a story. You could often tell a person's role just by looking at them. The hunter's worn deerskin, the farmer's patched homespun, the trader's brightly colored capote coat. Each garment revealed a person's occupation, their origins, and the daily necessities of their life. A pair of well-worn moccasins spoke of countless miles traveled. A powder-stained hunting shirt told tales of long days spent in the woods. And a mother's hand-sewn dress for her child was woven not just with thread, but with her love and labor. On the frontier, clothing was both a shield and a story. As we close this chapter, take a moment to picture it: the layers of fur and leather, the soft, silent tread of moccasins on the forest floor, the rhythmic slide of snowshoes across a frozen landscape. Imagine that wool cloak pulled tight against a storm, the hat brim dripping with rain, the mittens holding warmth in the biting, icy air. Now think for a moment about your own armor. Maybe it isn't leather or fur, but the layers of care, habit, and preparation you carry with you into your daily life. What do you wrap around yourself for protection? What do you mend and preserve so it will last through the seasons? The frontier teaches us that clothing was never about vanity. It was about resilience. Each garment stitched the story of survival into daily life. And so, in your own journey, remember this: what you carry on your back, whether it's fabric or faith, can be your shield against the storms. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Until next time, stay strong and stay resilient. Imagine a world where sickness and injury were as certain as the sunrise. A deep cut from an axe, a raging fever in the dead of winter, a childbirth suddenly gone wrong. On the American frontier, these moments weren't just possibilities. They were a constant looming reality. In this world, doctors were a myth for many, a distant luxury days away by horse or wagon. So when crisis struck, where did families turn? They turned inward. They turned to the land, to memories passed down through generations, to ancient traditions, and to the quiet, unshakable courage of those who dared to heal with only the tools at hand. Healing without doctors was never a simple matter. It was a delicate dance of herbal knowledge, improvised remedies, and sheer, stubborn determination. At times it was crude, it was painful, and it was terrifying. Yet more often than you might think, it worked. Not because of advanced science or sterile equipment, but because it had to. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and on the frontier it was the mother of survival itself. The vast untamed wilderness became the pioneer's medicine chest. The very landscape offered a pharmacy, if you only knew where to look and what to listen for. Take the willow tree. Its bark, steeped into a bitter tea, was a go-to remedy for easing pain and bringing down a fever. Settlers didn't know about salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin. They just knew it as a gift from the tree, a reliable friend in times of distress. Poultices were another cornerstone of frontier medicine. Imagine crushing fresh herbs like plantain leaves and pressing them directly onto an inflamed wound or a nasty burn, then wrapping it tightly with a strip of cloth. These weren't just old wives' tales. They were practical methods to draw out infection, reduce swelling, and soothe the skin. Comfrey, with its telling nickname Bone Knit, was mashed and applied to bruises and even fractures, believed to speed up the mending process. And then there were the teas. A simple pot of hot water could unlock the healing power of countless wildflowers and roots. A warm mug of peppermint tea was the first line of defense against a stomachache. Chamomile, with its gentle apple-like scent, was sipped to calm frayed nerves and lull a restless child to sleep. Yarrow, a common field plant, was known for its ability to help staunch bleeding from a cut or wound. This knowledge wasn't created in a vacuum. Every region had its own unique wisdom, much of it learned directly from native peoples who had walked and understood these lands for millennia. Settlers who were willing to set aside their prejudice and simply watch, listen, and learn gained access to a library of herbal cures that had been tested over generations. In a world without drugstores or prescriptions, these humble plants were more than just medicine. They were a tangible form of hope. But not every ailment could be soothed with a gentle tea or a simple poultice. Sometimes, the body demanded more drastic, more terrifying measures. Frontier surgery was rarely performed by trained physicians. It was a grim task attempted by anyone with steady hands, a strong stomach, and the raw courage to face what had to be done. A bullet lodged deep in a limb, a wound festering with infection, a broken bone that had set crooked. These were situations that called for immediate, however crude, action. The methods were basic, born of desperation. Knives were sterilized by boiling them in water or holding them directly in the flames of a fire. Whiskey served a dual purpose, a splash to clean the wound and a stiff drink to dull the patient's pain and calm their nerves. Patients were given a wooden stick or a thick leather strap to bite down on, a desperate attempt to muffle the screams that would inevitably follow. The work was brutal, but it was often life-saving. Broken bones were forcefully reset, and then held in place with splints fashioned from pieces of wood and strips of cloth. Deep gashes were stitched shut with a regular sewing needle and thread pulled from a garment. Even amputations, the most dreaded procedure of all, were performed when a limb was too mangled or when a raging infection threatened to consume the entire body. In these moments, survival depended less on precise surgical technique and more on raw willpower. Both the healer's will to act and the patient's strength to endure the unimaginable. For the women of the frontier, the miracle of childbirth was shadowed by constant danger. Without access to doctors or hospitals, the community midwife became the guardian of life at its very threshold. These women were rarely formally educated. Their degrees were earned through years of experience. They were often older women, mothers and grandmothers themselves, who carried a deep intuitive knowledge of the body. They knew the signs of a healthy labor. They could recognize the subtle warnings of a complication, and they had a basket full of herbs to ease pain, encourage contractions, or slow bleeding. Stories passed down through families are filled with dramatic midnight rides to fetch the midwife. Her arrival with her calming presence and her simple tools, clean cloths, herbs, and perhaps some soap, was a beacon of hope. She was more than just a medical assistant. She was a figure of profound comfort, a trusted guide in those primal moments where fear and hope met in equal measure. With her steady hands and quiet, encouraging voice, she guided countless new lives into the world, often in the dim light of a single candle in a remote log cabin. We can't talk about frontier healing without acknowledging the immense wisdom of Native American medicine men and women. Their knowledge wasn't just about which plant to use. It was a holistic practice passed down through centuries, combining herbal remedies with spiritual understanding and sacred rituals. Their approach saw the body, mind, and spirit as interconnected. Some settlers, initially wary or dismissive, came to deeply respect this wisdom out of sheer necessity. They learned about the power of echinacea to fight infections, the use of tobacco smoke as an insect repellent, and the cleansing properties of burning cedar. They witnessed how rituals of song and prayer were an integral part of the healing process, reminding everyone that true wellness was as much a matter of the spirit as it was of the body. These exchanges weren't always easy or straightforward, but where openness and mutual respect existed, survival often blossomed. Settlers adopted remedies they never would have discovered on their own, finding new ways to endure the harshness of their environment. The journals and letters of frontier families hold the quiet, personal testimonies of these daily struggles. One father wrote of his young son being struck down by a terrible fever. With no doctor to call, the family did the only thing they could. They brewed willow bark tea, day and night. Slowly, miraculously, the fever broke. The father described it not as a scientific victory but as an act of grace, the tree itself offering life. Another account tells of a young woman who cut her leg deeply with an axe. Miles from any help, her neighbors gathered by firelight. Using a curved needle from a sewing kit and strong thread, they carefully stitched the wound closed. She healed, bearing a scar that became a story of both agonizing pain and incredible community triumph. And threaded through all these accounts are the midwives, figures remembered not for wealth or fame, but for the steady, quiet number of lives they saved. Their names are often lost to history, but their legacy lives on in the families who exist today because of their skilled and compassionate hands. Ultimately, healing on the frontier required more than just remedies and rudimentary skills. It required a special kind of courage, the willingness to face fear head-on, to act decisively even when plagued by doubt. Every poultice placed on a wound, every broken bone set, every baby delivered in a rustic cabin was an act of defiance against the unforgiving wilderness. It was a powerful declaration. We will not surrender. We will meet sickness and injury with the knowledge we have and the resources at hand, and we will endure. This courage wasn't loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, and often went unseen beyond the walls of a single cabin. But it was this courage that shaped the survival of generations and built a nation. As we let these stories settle, take a moment. Picture that frontier cabin, lit only by the flickering firelight. A child lies sick, and a parent patiently brews a tea from bark gathered just hours before. A deep wound is bound with herbs from the nearby woods. A midwife kneels beside a laboring mother, whispering words of encouragement as a new cry, a new life, fills the small room. These were not acts of convenience or luxury. They were acts of pure survival, born from a powerful combination of necessity and love. Now think of your own life. You may not face the same physical dangers, but we all carry our own needs for healing. It might be a kind word you offer a friend who is struggling, a simple gesture of care for a loved one, or even taking a quiet moment of rest for yourself. These too are medicines, subtle, powerful, and enduring. The frontier teaches us a profound lesson, that healing isn't always found in a doctor's office or a hospital. Sometimes it's found in hands that are willing to help, in wisdom passed quietly from one person to another, and in the simple, profound courage to try. Thank you for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of our shared past. Until next time, take care and be well. We've talked about building a life, finding food and weathering the storms. But the frontier was not just a place of beauty and opportunity. It was also a realm of constant danger. Every sunrise brought promise, but every sunset carried the possibility of peril. Families might wake to birdsong, but by evening, they could hear the distant howl of wolves or the crash of a bear moving through the brush. And beyond the threats of nature were the tensions of human conflict. In such a world, defense wasn't an option. It was as essential as food, water, or shelter. To survive, frontiersmen and women learned to defend their cabins, their families, and themselves, not with armies or fortresses, but with courage, strategy, and the tools they held in their hands. Today we explore the stark reality of survival and the skills that kept hope alive in the face of fear. The cabin was more than just wood and a roof. It was a sanctuary. Protecting it became a constant, unending duty. The very way a cabin was built reflected this reality. Logs weren't just stacked for warmth. They were arranged for defense. Windows were often small, narrow slits, positioned high off the ground to make them difficult targets for arrows or gunfire. Doors weren't just simple planks. They were reinforced with heavy wooden bars that could be dropped into place, turning a home into a makeshift fortress. In some settlements, you'd find cabins grouped together, forming a small square or stockade. This wasn't just for community, it was a defensive formation. If danger arrived, families could rush to one another's aid, creating a united front. Nighttime brought its own set of challenges. Fires were banked low, their embers glowing just enough for warmth but not enough to broadcast their location to distant eyes. Dogs were more than pets. They were the first line of defense, an early warning system whose growls could alert a family long before trouble reached the door. Every sound in the forest, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, a distant howl, was listened to with razor-sharp attention. The cabin wasn't merely a home, it was the last line of defense between safety and the perilous unknown. Of course, the wilderness was home to predators as ancient as the land itself. Wolves, bears, cougars. Each commanded respect and, at times, a healthy dose of fear. Wolves, traveling in packs, filled the frozen nights with their haunting howls. While they rarely attacked humans directly, a harsh winter and gnawing hunger could make them bold. Settlers learned to keep their precious livestock close, often inside crude pens or, in the most extreme weather, even bringing smaller animals inside the cabin. A ring of fire and blazing torches were powerful deterrents, their light a clear signal that humans held this ground. Bears were another matter entirely. Black bears were persistent raiders of food stores, capable of tearing into a smokehouse with astonishing strength. Grizzlies found in certain regions were a force of nature, powerful and unpredictable. A startled or cornered bear was a deadly threat. This is where the rifle became absolutely essential, not for sport, but for sheer survival. Countless frontier stories tell of hunters and homesteaders facing a charging bear with only seconds to react, their lives hanging on a single, well-placed shot. Even smaller predators like coyotes and bobcats posed a constant threat to chickens, lambs, and even small children. Every encounter was a test of awareness, readiness, and resolve. Frontiersmen and women didn't live in a state of constant, paralyzing fear, but they did live with constant preparation. It was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. People rarely traveled alone. Moving in pairs or small groups meant more eyes watching every direction, more hands ready to help. They chose their paths with care, avoiding dense undergrowth where an ambush could be sprung. At night, weapons were always within arm's reach, often hung on pegs above the fireplace or laid beside the bed. Children were taught survival skills from a young age, how to be silent on command, where to hide if danger appeared, and to trust implicitly in the watchful protection of their parents. But perhaps the most powerful strategy for defense was community. Neighbors stood ready to help one another at a moment's notice. A universal signal of distress, like firing a rifle 3 times in quick succession, would carry through the still air, bringing others running with their own weapons. A single family was vulnerable. But together, a settlement stood strong. Few objects on the frontier carried as much weight, both practically and symbolically, as the rifle. First and foremost, it was a tool. The rifle put meat on the table, bringing down deer, elk, and wild turkey to feed a hungry family. It defended livestock from predators and guarded precious crops from raiding animals. And when all else failed, it was the final barrier between life and death. But the rifle was also a powerful symbol. It represented independence and self-reliance, the ability to provide for and protect one's own. Rifles were cherished heirlooms, passed down through generations, their wooden stocks polished smooth by countless hands, sometimes inscribed with initials or marks that told a family's story. A man's rifle was seen as an extension of himself, carried across thousands of miles, leaned upon during long hunts and held tightly in moments of terror. Children grew up watching their fathers by the firelight, learning the quiet ritual of cleaning the rifle, measuring the powder, and setting the ball. To inherit a rifle was to inherit not just a weapon, but a profound responsibility. Beyond the dangers of the wilderness lay a harder, more tragic truth: conflict with other people. As settlers pushed westward, the land that had belonged to Native American tribes for centuries became a source of contention. Misunderstandings, broken promises, and the relentless pressure for expansion ignited a cycle of raids, reprisals, and terrible violence. Families on both sides of this conflict bore the deep, lasting scars of the struggle. In these times, the rifle became both a tool of protection and a burden. It offered a settler family a chance to defend their isolated cabin, yet it also symbolized the harsh, violent divide between peoples who, in another world, might have found a way to share the land in peace. For the homesteader, defense wasn't about conquest, it was purely about survival. Mothers clutched their children close while fathers stood guard, rifle at the ready. Cabins once built simply for shelter from the elements sometimes became fortresses in a war they never sought but could not escape. Fragments of these struggles survive today in diaries and oral histories, giving us a glimpse into those desperate moments. One family told of a night when a wolf pack surrounded their cabin, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. The father fired his rifle into the shadows while the mother frantically fed logs into the fire, keeping the flames roaring. By dawn, the wolves had vanished, leaving only their tracks in the fresh snow as a reminder of the night's terror. Another account describes a massive grizzly bear tearing apart a smokehouse. The alarm was raised and neighbors gathered with torches and rifles, their combined shouts in the blazing light finally driving the powerful beast back into the woods. And a quieter, more chilling story tells of a family surviving a raid by huddling silently in the darkness of their cabin, the rifle clutched in trembling hands, listening as the danger passed just outside their door. Their lives depended on stillness, on patience, and on the simple strength of their wooden walls. For those on the frontier, defense wasn't a rare, dramatic event. It was a way of life, a steady rhythm beneath the surface of daily chores. Just as firewood was stacked for winter and food was preserved for the lean months, so too was a state of readiness maintained. This didn't mean they lived without joy. Families still laughed, sang, and celebrated births and harvests. But underneath it all lay a quiet, sober awareness. Survival depended on vigilance. The cabin door barred securely at night, the rifle cleaned and ready, the dog sleeping by the hearth. These were habits born not of fear, but of profound wisdom and a fierce love for the life they were building. As we close this chapter, I want you to imagine a frontier cabin at dusk. The fire glows low inside. A rifle rests by the door. Outside, the vast, beautiful, and sometimes dangerous forest waits. Within those walls, a family huddles close, safe in the knowledge that they are prepared. Defense on the frontier wasn't about aggression. It was about love, a love strong enough to guard your children, protect your home, and endure against the unknown. And so, think about your own defenses today. They may not be rifles or log walls, but the boundaries, habits, and choices that protect the life you value. What shields have you built for yourself and those you love? What vigilance do you keep, not from fear, but from care? The frontier reminds us that defense, when it's born of love, isn't a burden. It's a quiet act of devotion. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the past. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe. Often it's the image of a rugged individual, a lone hunter stalking through the woods, a solitary trapper in a snowbound cabin, or a single family carving out a life with their own two hands. But there's a quieter, more profound truth to the story of the frontier. No one survived alone for long. The wilderness was simply too vast, the dangers too many, the needs too constant. A single person might endure for a season, maybe even a few years, but true survival, the kind that weathers harsh winters, droughts, and the gnawing ache of uncertainty, depended on community. Out on the edge of civilization, every neighbor was a lifeline, and every gathering was an act of collective strength. Barn raisings, hunting parties, trading posts, these weren't just activities. They were the threads that stitched scattered settlers into something that resembled society. Independence was prized, yes, but it was softened and strengthened by cooperation. Imagine a single log cabin standing alone in the forest. Its walls are stout, its chimney steady. But what happens when illness strikes, when wolves begin to circle, or when the crops fail? A single family, no matter how resilient, can't face every challenge alone. This is where neighbors made the difference between hardship and hope. They lent tools without expecting immediate return, shared food during times of famine, and sent helping hands whenever disaster struck. Children would run freely between the scattered cabins, building bonds of friendship that grew into lifelong loyalty. Even the most fiercely independent frontiersmen knew that being cut off from others was the ultimate vulnerability. The wilderness didn't respect pride, it demanded cooperation. Few events captured this spirit of cooperation better than the barn raising. When a family needed a barn, they didn't hire a construction crew. Instead, the entire community gathered. Men lifted heavy logs, hammered beams, and fit rafters into place, their coordinated efforts turning a pile of timber into a sturdy structure. The women prepared enormous feasts, brewed drinks, and tended to the children, turning a day of hard labor into a social event. Laughter mixed with sweat as the work progressed. By nightfall, the skeleton of a new barn stood tall against the sky, and with it came the certainty that this family, and by extension the whole community, had grown stronger. A barn raising was more than just construction. It was a festival of fellowship, a powerful declaration that no one would be left to struggle alone. The finished barn stood as a monument to the idea that survival was shared. Hunting, too, often became a community effort. While tracking a deer might be a solitary skill, pursuing larger game like buffalo or elk, or dealing with dangerous predators, required teamwork. Hunting parties would form at dawn, rifles polished and ready, dogs restless with excitement. Together, the men would track their prey across forests and plains, using strategy and clear communication to drive the game into range. The risks were real. A wounded animal could charge, or the scent of blood could attract other predators. But by working together, the hunters watched each other's backs. The rewards were also shared. A successful hunt fed more than just one family. Neighbors would gather to divide the meat, tan the hides, and preserve what couldn't be eaten right away. To hunt together was to survive together, bound by both the shared danger and the shared feast that followed. While cabins and barns marked the private lives of settlers, it was the trading posts that served as the pulse of community life. Often, little more than rough-hewn buildings set up along trails or rivers, these posts became vital crossroads of necessity. Here, furs were traded for gunpowder, corn was exchanged for iron tools, and precious news was passed from traveler to settler, connecting distant places. But trading posts were more than just markets. They were centers of conversation, laughter, and storytelling. They offered a glimpse of the larger world. Fabrics dyed in bright colors, tools shaped by distant blacksmiths, and sometimes even letters carried from faraway kin. To walk into a trading post was to feel a little less alone, a welcome reminder that your small cabin was part of a much wider web of humanity. The pioneers valued their independence fiercely. Relying too heavily on others was often seen as a sign of weakness, yet rejecting cooperation entirely was pure folly. The true art of survival on the frontier lay in finding the right balance, standing strong as an individual, while leaning on the community when needed. A farmer tilled his own field, but he depended on his neighbors when it was time to raise his barn. A hunter might stalk a deer in solitude, but he joined a party for the larger, more dangerous hunts. A mother nursed her children by her own hearth, but she trusted a midwife from the community to help her when a new life was coming into the world. The frontier taught a crucial lesson. Independence is not the same as isolation. It is a strength that is shared when necessary and offered when asked. Cooperation didn't weaken freedom. It was the very thing that preserved it. The history of the frontier is filled with stories of neighbors saving one another. One old record tells of a family struck by a terrible illness in the dead of winter. With both parents bedridden, their neighbors brought food every day, chopped their firewood, and tended to their children until everyone had recovered. Another story describes a barn being struck by lightning and burning to the ground. By the next morning, half the community had gathered with tools and timber, and by sundown, a new frame was already rising from the ashes. Even in times of conflict, When families might quarrel over fences or livestock, they would stand shoulder to shoulder when a common danger threatened them all. In that unity, survival became possible. But beyond mere survival, community offered something just as vital: comfort. The sound of laughter at a barn raising, the shared prayer at a funeral, the cheerful hum of voices at a trading post. These moments gave meaning to lives that were otherwise marked by constant hardship. Children grew up with the secure knowledge that they belonged to something larger than their immediate family. Elders aged with dignity, cared for by the same hands they had once helped raise. In this way, community was more than just practical. It was deeply human, a constant reminder that no one was truly alone on the vast, quiet edge of the wilderness. Imagine it now. A single cabin's smoke rises into the cold air, soon joined by others all along the valley. Neighbors gather to lift heavy beams, to track game through the forest, to trade goods and stories at the post. Alone, each family is small and vulnerable, but together, they are strong. So, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Where do you find your community? Who are the neighbors, friends, or family who step forward when your own strength runs thin? And in turn, when do you lend your hands, your time, and your care to others? The frontier whispers a simple but powerful truth across the centuries. No one survives alone for long. Independence gives us resilience, but it is community that gives us endurance. Tonight, rest easy in the knowledge that you too are part of a greater web. Whether they are near or far, whether in family, friendship, or even just memory, there are others who walk beside you. And just like the barn raising, the hunt, or the trading post, life itself is so much stronger when it is shared. If this story has given you something to think about on your own journey, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me how community has shaped your life. And, if you'd like more stories like this, gentle tales of history, survival, and reflection, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep building this circle, one listener at a time. Thank you for being here.